In May 1976, Stephen Spurrier, a British wine merchant based in Paris, organized a blind tasting at the Intercontinental Hotel. He invited the best French judges he could gather, sommeliers, critics, and restaurateurs who set the global standard for what distinguished a great wine from a simple alcoholic beverage. He served them 15 wines in identical, unlabeled glasses, 9 French and 6 Californian. The judges tasted, scored, and handed in their sheets. When Spurrier's associate tallied the results, the highest-rated white wine was a Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena in the Napa Valley. The highest-scoring red was a Cabernet Sauvignon from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. Also from Napa, the French wines had lost to California in a tasting held in Paris and judged by French experts who did not know what they were drinking. The reactions were immediate. One of the judges, upon learning which wine she had given her highest score, claimed that the result must reflect the difficulties she had experienced that day. Another tried to get his score sheet back. The director of the French regulatory body, responsible for appellations of origin, questioned the methodology. The French press, for the most part, refused to cover the event. Time magazine published a brief note in the United States. The story became known among wine historians as the Judgment of Paris. The afternoon, when a 2-hour tasting put an end to a century of unquestionable French supremacy, while France officially treated the event as if it had never happened. This is not a story about the inferiority of French wine. It is a story about what happens when a product, a country, and a set of traditions accumulate so much prestige over so many centuries that this prestige ceases to be an argument and becomes a fact, and about what happens when that fact is confronted with a blind tasting. To understand how France got there, you have to go back, not to Burgundy or Bordeaux, but to the mountains of the present-day Republic of Georgia. Around the year 6000 BC, someone buried a clay vessel in the earth and let it work over the winter. Origins: the oldest wine in the world. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional winemaking comes from the South Caucasus in 2017. Archaeologists working at 2 Neolithic sites south of Tbilisi, Gadakrilli Gora and Shulaveris Gora, found ceramic vessels dating between 6000 and 5800 BC. Inside, they found residues of tartaric, malic, citric, and succinic acids. The chemical signature of fermented grape juice. The vessels were qvevri, large egg-shaped clay jars designed to be buried and sealed with beeswax. They predate the next oldest evidence of winemaking found in Armenia and Iran by several centuries. The grape species used was Vitis vinifera, the same one that today produces every bottle of Burgundy, Bordeaux, Barolo, or Rioja. Vitis vinifera originated in the South Caucasus and grew wild in the mountainous forests of present-day Georgia, Armenia, and northeastern Turkey. Wild grapes contain everything wine needs: sugar in the ripe fruit, natural yeasts on the skin, and a climate that allows fermentation to proceed slowly enough to produce something drinkable rather than a substance that rots immediately. It is almost certain that wine emerged before anyone decided to make it. Overripe grapes inside a sealed clay vessel, yeasts that activate in the absence of air, and a resulting liquid that intoxicates and preserves itself better than the fruit itself. What the Neolithic Georgians added was intention. The qvevri from Gadakrilli Gora were made expressly for that purpose. They were lined with beeswax. They were buried to maintain a stable temperature throughout the seasons and were used systematically, not accidentally. In the South Caucasus of 6000 BC, wine was no longer a discovery. It was a practice that had moved beyond the scale of the fortuitous and was carried out deliberately by people who understood the process well enough to build specific equipment. All this happened before the Sumerians had writing, before the pyramids of Egypt existed, and before anything recognizable as urban civilization appeared in most of the world. Georgia has never stopped making wine this way. The qvevri tradition survived Greek colonization, Roman conquest, Persian invasion, Mongol destruction, annexation to the Russian Empire, and Soviet collectivization. Today, Georgian natural wine made in buried clay jars is one of the fastest growing categories in the global premium wine market. Orange wines, skin contact wines, unfiltered and unfined, amber-colored and tannic in character, made just like 8,000 years ago. The world's oldest winemaking tradition is simultaneously the newest trend in the best wine bars of London, New York, and Tokyo. This story ends where Egypt, Greece, and the invention of wine culture begin. Wine left the South Caucasus through trade routes and Greek colonization of the Black Sea coast by 3000 BC. It was already present in Egypt, where it appeared in tomb paintings, administrative records, and royal cellars, both as a luxury and a political instrument. Egyptian wine was expensive enough that only the rich could consume it regularly, and its quality was recorded using a primitive classification system. The labels on amphorae from Egyptian estates indicated the vintage, the producer, the location of the vineyard, and a quality rating: good, very good, or exceptionally good. This is the first written evidence of wine evaluation in history. The Egyptians were already writing wine reviews before the Greeks invented the alphabet. Greece transformed wine from a luxury into a social institution. The symposium, the formal drinking gathering of aristocratic Greek men, was organized around wine diluted with water, conversation, music, and what the Greeks called the pleasures of the mind. Drinking undiluted wine was considered a barbaric practice of those who had not learned to moderate their appetites. The usual proportion at a symposium was 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or 2 to 1, enough to cause mild intoxication over several hours, but calculated to maintain intelligent conversation and prevent its degradation. In this framework, wine was a civilizing technology, the very thing that distinguished Greek culture from the cultures that surrounded it. The god of wine, Dionysus, was also the god of theater, ecstasy, and transformation. The religious festivals celebrated in his honor gave rise to the first Greek dramatic works. Both tragedy and comedy emerged from the same ritual context as collective drinking and altered states of consciousness. This connection was not an accidental detail of Greek culture. It was central. The two great products of the Greek mind that Western civilization claims as its foundations, rational philosophy and theatrical drama, were born from a culture that organized its social and intellectual life around a fermented beverage. Platonic dialogues emerged from the symposium culture. One of Plato's greatest philosophical works is titled The Symposium and takes place during a gathering where people drink and debate the nature of love. Greek colonization took viticulture westward across the Mediterranean. The Greek settlement of Massalia, the future Marseille, introduced vine cultivation to the region, which would eventually become the world's most famous wine-producing area. Local Gallic populations traded gold, tin, and slaves for amphorae of Greek wine in such massive quantities that archaeologists have found them by the thousands all over southern France. The hunger for wine in France predates its vineyards by several centuries. The French did not create wine culture. It was brought to them by Greek colonists, and the Gauls wanted it so badly that they were willing to sell their own people to get it. The economic scale of the Greek wine trade is often underestimated because it operated before the administrative records existed that would later allow historians to understand it clearly. But archaeological evidence fills that gap. Amphorae, from specific Greek production centers, identified by the composition of their clay, the stamps on their handles, and their characteristic profiles, appear in Celtic fortresses in northern France and Iberian settlements in Spain. They also appear in trading posts on the Black Sea coast and in sites in southern Russia and Ukraine. At its peak during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Greek wine trade was one of the most extensive trade networks the ancient world had ever known. Wine was not a secondary element of Greek expansion. It was one of its primary engines. The first wine empire. Rome took Greek wine culture and industrialized it. At its peak, the Roman Empire produced wine on a scale that the world would not see again until the 19th century. Vineyards covered the hills of Italy, Hispania, Gaul, and North Africa. Roman wine circulated throughout the empire in standardized ceramic amphorae, whose remains, recognizable by their distinctive shapes and the stamped marks of their producers, allow the geography of Roman trade to be reconstructed more precisely than almost any other object. Mount Testaccio, in Rome, a hill about 50 meters high, is made entirely of broken amphorae, the ancient equivalent of a landfill built with the containers of roughly 1 million shipments deposited over several centuries. The Roman wine market was stratified in a way that would be familiar to the modern premium wine market. Falernian, from the volcanic slopes of Campania, was the most prestigious wine in the Roman world. It was aged for decades in sealed amphorae, drunk exclusively at elite banquets, and mentioned by Pliny, Horace, and Virgil as the benchmark against which all other wines should be measured. Ordinary wine, the posca that soldiers drank, diluted with water and vinegar, was produced on large agricultural estates in what are now southern France and Spain, and shipped in bulk to Mediterranean ports. The Roman market had already developed the basic commercial architecture of the great crus and mass production that the 1855 Bordeaux classification would codify 18 centuries later. Wine also structured Roman social life in ways that went far beyond the symposium model established by Greece. Romans drank wine at every meal, at social events, in religious ceremonies, and as everyday medicine. A Roman cookbook by Apicius, written in the early days of the empire, includes wine as an ingredient in dozens of dishes, indicating that it was as commonly available as water. The difference was that water was free and wine was not. That is why the quality of the wine someone drank and the occasions on which they did so were perfectly legible indicators of their social standing. A slave drank posca. A freedman drank cheap Gallic table wine. And a senator drank Falernian, if he wanted to show he could afford it. In Rome, wine was not just a drink. It was a vocabulary of status. Pliny the Elder, who wrote in the 1st century AD, developed a classification of Italian wines by quality and region that can be directly recognized as the ancestor of the systems governing premium wine today. He described specific hillsides as superior to adjacent valleys. He identified exceptional vintages from up to a century earlier and noted which regions had lost quality because commercial production had displaced excellence. He also formulated what French wine would later call terroir, the idea that specific geographical conditions produce wine characteristics impossible to replicate elsewhere. When Pliny claimed that the volcanic soils of the hillsides above the Bay of Naples yielded wines of uncommon richness, he was defending a relationship between place and wine that Burgundy would not formalize until the 11th century. Roman winegrowers in Gaul also introduced something more practically important than any classification: the wooden barrel, adapting to local craft traditions. They began using oak barrels alongside traditional amphorae to store and transport wine. The properties of oak: its porosity, which allows a slow exchange of oxygen, and its natural compounds, which over time impart tannins and notes of vanilla, produced wines that aged differently and, in many cases, more interestingly than those stored in amphorae. After the fall of Rome, the oak barrel became the dominant vessel for European wine and remained so until the 20th century. It was a Gallic innovation adopted by Roman winemakers that ended up becoming the technology with which virtually all prestigious wine aged for 2,000 years. When the Roman system collapsed in the 5th century, the wine trade fell with it. Long-distance amphora networks dissolved. The vast agricultural estates that had supplied wine to the entire empire reverted to local subsistence farming. Wine production did not disappear, but the administrative infrastructure that had supported large-scale trade and the urban markets that had sustained demand for high quality did. Wine survived the fall of Rome for one single reason: the church needed it. The church saves wine and accidentally invents champagne. The Eucharist requires wine. This single liturgical fact preserved European viticulture. During the centuries following the collapse of Rome, monasteries needed wine for Mass. At the same time, they were the most stable, best funded, and most literate institutions in post-Roman Europe. The combination produced something that no secular institution of the time could have maintained: a continuous tradition of careful winemaking through several centuries of political instability. When the commercial systems that made quality production viable had already vanished, the Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries of Burgundy were responsible for identifying the plots that today constitute the Burgundian Grand Cru. Generation after generation, monks walked the same fields, tasted the fruit, compared vintages, and noted which plots consistently produced the best wines. They possessed an institutional memory that commercial enterprises almost never managed to accumulate, and a motivation that went beyond profit. The wine was for the mass that connected the community to God, and producing an inferior wine was a religious failure as much as an economic one. Furthermore, they had the necessary stability to observe the same plots for centuries, not just for decades. The Clos de Vougeot, one of the most famous vineyards in the world, was created by Cistercian monks who built a stone wall around the plot they had identified as the best in the Côte de Nuits. The vineyards those monks considered superior in the 11th and 12th centuries are, in essence, the same ones whose bottles today fetch hundreds of dollars. The Cistercians did not just make wine in Burgundy. They created Burgundy, Dom Pierre Pérignon, a 17th century Benedictine cellar master at the Abbey of Hautevillers in the Champagne region, is commonly credited with the invention of champagne. The story is incorrect in almost all its details. Sparkling wine was already appearing in the region before Pérignon arrived, and it is possible that English merchants, who received still wine from Champagne and bottled it with added sugar, understood the secondary fermentation that generates bubbles even before Pérignon was born. In reality, Pérignon dedicated a good part of his career to doing exactly the opposite. He tried to eliminate the bubbles, which were considered a defect and a sign of incomplete fermentation that left untransformed sugar. The phrase attributed to him, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars," was almost certainly invented by a monk who wrote about him 70 years after his death. Perignon's true contributions were the technique of blending and quality control. He may have been the first to deliberately blend the must from different plots to create a consistent house style. Understanding that no single plot produces exactly the same wine in every vintage, cleverly combining them yields a more reliable result than any of their components separately. Today, this is standard practice in champagne production and in many other wine regions. His contribution was not the bubbles, it was the blend. The truth about the origins of champagne is stranger than the myth. Bubbles appeared because the region's cold climate halted fermentation before all the sugar was consumed. The wine was bottled, Spring arrived. The rising temperatures reactivated the yeasts, and the carbon dioxide produced had nowhere to escape. The first bottles of champagne exploded frequently. Historical records from 17th century cellars describe losses of between 20 and 40% of stock every spring due to spontaneous detonations. Cellar workers wore iron masks. It was the British who received the wine in barrels and bottled it themselves with added sugar, who first recognized that the bubbles were the product and not the problem. They commissioned stronger bottles from English glassmakers. They developed the wire cage that secures the cork against the pressure and created the sparkling wine market. The drink most associated with French celebrations was created by English merchants trying to solve a storage problem with French wine. Napoleon and the 8-week classification. The 1855 classification of Bordeaux wines is one of the most momentous documents in the history of food and drink. It was drafted by the Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce with only an 8-week deadline. At the request of Napoleon III and for a trade exhibition in 1853, Napoleon III commissioned a grand universal exhibition for Paris scheduled for 1855, intending to showcase France's commercial and industrial achievements. He wanted to include a presentation of French wines for the visitors. The Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce was tasked with organizing a classification of its wines, lacking the time and resources to conduct independent evaluations. The chamber turned to the Bordeaux winebrokers, the negociants, who actually bought and sold the bottles, and asked them to rank the chateau. The brokers did what brokers do. They ranked them by their market price. The chateau that had consistently fetched the highest prices over the previous decades became Premier Cru. The next ones were Deuxième Cru, and so on down to Cinquième Cru. The document reflected the collective valuation of the market expressed through price over time, not the independent judgment of a panel of experts. The 1855 classification has barely changed since then. Of the original 61 chateaux, 60 remain in exactly the same position today. The sole exception is Mouton Rothschild, elevated from second to first growth in 1973. After decades of relentless lobbying by Baron Philippe de Rothschild, the ownership of all classified chateaux has changed. Winemaking practices have transformed. Critic ratings have varied substantially. The list has not moved. Chateaux that today produce exceptional wines, but were irrelevant in 1855, remain unclassified. Others that were extraordinary back then, but have declined since, retain their original category. The durability of the 1855 system is partly explained by the same mechanism that made the judgment of Paris a threat. Prestige compounds upon itself. A Premier Cru sells for a high price. In part because it is a Premier Cru, that high price confirms its status as a Premier Cru. The classification and the price began to prop each other up, making it extremely difficult to revise either. A clear classification change would mean acknowledging that the price hierarchy had divorced from the quality hierarchy, something market participants had enormous financial incentives to deny. The document, drafted in 8 weeks for a trade exhibition, ended up becoming the self-reinforcing architecture of one of the world's most valuable commodity markets, precisely because no one who benefited from it had any interest in questioning it. The 1855 classification also produced something its authors had not foreseen: a model of prestige that spread throughout the fine wine world. Burgundy developed its own classification, organized around Premier Cru and Grand Cru plots instead of chateau ownership. Italy created its DOC and DOCG systems. Spain developed its denominaciones de origen. Germany built its Predicat hierarchy. Each system was different in its structure, but identical in its function: an official declaration that certain wines were, by definition, more prestigious than others, and that this hierarchy was stable and should not be revised based on current performance. Napoleon III had asked for a list of good wines for a trade show. What he got was the architecture of prestige wine culture for the next 2 centuries, Phylloxera, the American aphid that destroyed Europe. In the early 1860s, Jules-Émile Planchon, a French botanist investigating a vine disease in the southern Rhone Valley, noticed that the plants were dying in a geographical pattern that suggested a transmission rather than a soil problem. He examined the roots of the sick vines under a microscope and discovered that they were covered in tiny yellow insects, a species he had never seen. He identified it as an aphid native to the eastern United States. Dactylosphera vitifoliae, grape Phylloxera, had almost certainly reached Europe on specimens of American varieties sent to European botanical collections as scientific curiosities. American grape species had co-evolved with Phylloxera for millions of years and had developed resistance. The European Vitis vinifera had never been exposed to it and had no defense whatsoever. The insect fed on the roots, disrupting nutrient absorption, and the plants died a few years after infection. From its first appearance in the southern Rhone in the early 1860s, Phylloxera reached Burgundy, Bordeaux, Champagne, and all the wine regions of Europe. By 1880, France had lost approximately 1/3 of its vineyard area. By 1900, European losses were approaching half. Entire winemaking traditions that had existed for centuries were destroyed in a single generation. The devastation was not uniform, but it was widespread. In Cognac, the brandy-producing region, whose base white varieties were highly vulnerable, the industry was on the verge of disappearing. In Bordeaux, the classified chateau had enough capital to replant. When a solution finally appeared, small producers did not. In Burgundy, the monasteries that had created Grand Cru viticulture over 7 centuries lost the vines they had tended, and the accumulated knowledge of exactly which specific plots were superior, it survived only in documents and institutional memory. The diversity of European wine, the accumulated variety of local traditions developed during centuries of geographical isolation, was partially erased in 40 years. The devastation was not uniform, but it was complete. In Cognac, the brandy-producing region whose base white varieties were highly vulnerable, the industry was on the verge of disappearing. In Bordeaux, the classified chateau had enough capital to replant when the solution finally arrived. Minor producers did not. In Burgundy, the monasteries that had created Grand Cru viticulture over 7 centuries lost the vines they had tended. In parts of southern France and Spain, local varieties cultivated for centuries disappeared because no one replanted them when they died. The diversity of European wine, the accumulated variety of local traditions developed during centuries of geographical isolation, was eliminated to a considerable extent in barely 40 years. The debate over the solution was bitter and prolonged. Some French wine growers proposed flooding the vineyards to drown the insect. Others advocated injecting carbon disulfide into the soil, a lethal poison that killed the Phylloxera but also harmed the vine and anyone who breathed in enough of it. The French government created commissions, offered prizes, and funded research for almost 2 decades without finding a reliable solution. The answer, when it arrived, was simultaneously elegant and deeply ironic. Grafting the European Vitis vinifera vines onto American rootstocks, the roots of American vines could resist Phylloxera. The European varieties grafted onto them could use those roots as a base and continue producing their own fruit above the graft union, keeping the character of the European variety intact. The first successful large-scale grafts were carried out in the late 1870s, and during the 1880s, the technique gradually spread through the devastated regions. As evidence of its effectiveness accumulated, this means that virtually every bottle of wine produced today in France, Italy, Spain, Germany, or Portugal save for rare exceptions from a few ungrafted vineyards where Phylloxera has never established itself, grows on American roots. The roots are American. The European character of the wine comes solely from the wood grafted above the union, Romanée-Conti. The most expensive wine in the world grows on American roots. Chateau Petrus grows on American roots. The wines the French judges poured at the 1976 Judgment of Paris, the very same ones they expected to outshine California, grew on American roots. The irony was already complete before the tasting even began. If this is the kind of story you are looking for, the stories hiding beneath other stories, the connections that standard accounts leave out. Subscribe. What comes next is equally strange. Prohibition. How the United States destroyed and rebuilt its own wine. The 18th Amendment, which went into effect in January 1920, devastated the American wine industry. Before Prohibition, California had around 700 wineries producing wines of increasing quality, leaning on traditions brought by German, Italian, and French immigrants who had realized that California's climate was comparable to the European regions they had left behind. By 1925, only a few operations dedicated to producing sacramental wine, permitted by law, were still functioning. The rest had closed, converted, or were making bootleg beverages whose quality ranged from mediocre to dangerous. Prohibition did not eliminate wine. It redirected it. A legal loophole allowed home producers to make up to 200 gallons a year for personal consumption. This created an immediate demand for grapes that could be shipped across the country to those making wine at home. Californian wine growers responded by planting thick-skinned, high-yield varieties capable of surviving for weeks on transcontinental trains without rotting. Alicante Boucher, almost unknown before Prohibition, became one of the most widely planted grapes in California because its tough skin and dense juice could withstand the journey. It produces a mediocre wine, but the goal was to survive the train ride. The cultural damage was deeper than the viticultural damage. 13 years of Prohibition steered American drinking culture away from wine and towards spirits like whiskey and gin, which were stronger, easier to conceal, and offered higher margins to illegal distribution networks. When Prohibition ended in 1933, wine started with a double disadvantage. Vineyards replanted with transport-resistant varieties and a market that had learned to drink differently. Rebuilding both elements would take decades and require a very specific kind of person, someone who had traveled to France, understood what European wine was, and believed that California could create something comparable. The repeal of Prohibition in December 1933 sparked an immediate, albeit brief, explosion of new wineries. Most produced undistinguished wines from unsuitable grapes and closed in less than a decade. The Great Depression hindered investment. World War II diverted the resources and attention of those who might have rebuilt quality. American wine culture was still recovering from 13 years of forced interruption, when the post-war period brought new wealth precisely to the social, educated, well-traveled, and aspirationally sophisticated group that would eventually create the domestic premium wine market. That market took 20 years to materialize. Robert Mondavi founded his winery in the Napa Valley in 1966 after a dispute with his family over the direction of the Charles Krug winery, which they managed together. Mondavi had traveled to France. He had spent time in Bordeaux and Burgundy. He understood what European wine could be and why, and he returned to California, convinced that Napa's climate was capable of producing something comparable. He cold fermented his Sauvignon Blanc in the Bordeaux style and renamed it Fumé Blanc to give it a French-sounding name that American consumers would take seriously. He collaborated with the Department of Enology at the University of California, Davis. He hired European consultants. He did not try to make Napa sound like Burgundy. He argued that Napa was Napa and that it could be excellent on its own terms. When Spurrier selected the wines for the Judgment of Paris, the Californian wineries he chose were the direct result of the ecosystem Mondavi had spent a decade building. The Judgment of Paris. The full story. Spurrier had moved from England to Paris in 1971 and opened a wine shop and school in the 8th arrondissement. By 1976, he was already well connected in the French wine world. And that was part of what made the judgment possible. He had the necessary contacts to gather truly credible judges. Among the 9 French experts he invited were the head sommelier of La Tour d'Argent, one of the most famous restaurants in Paris, the director of the Institut National des Appellations d'Origine, and a 3 Michelin star restaurateur. They were not marginal figures. Collectively, they represented the global authority on what a good wine meant. The tasting was organized to coincide with the United States bicentennial. Spurrier had visited California the previous year to select the wines. He chose 6 Californian whites and 4 Californian reds to face off against French wines from Burgundy and Bordeaux. His associate, Patricia Gallagher, poured the 15 wines blind into identical glasses without any identification. The judges tasted and scored. When Gallagher tallied the results, the Californian Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena obtained the highest total score among the whites, and the Californian Cabernet from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars came in first among the reds. Several judges, upon learning which wine they had placed first, claimed that the result must reflect the difficulties they had experienced that day, and not the quality of the wine. According to accounts, the director of the Institut National tried to retrieve his ballot. A restaurateur argued that the methodology was not rigorous enough. Le Monde published nothing. Le Figaro did not either. Time magazine circulated a brief note written by George Tabor, the only journalist present, and the story slowly circulated through the United States. Over the following months, it acquired the status of a defining event in the history of Californian wine. Follow-up tastings conducted over subsequent decades offered mixed results, something the French wine establishment used to argue that the 1976 outcome had been an anomaly. Spurrier organized a repeat in 1978 with the same wines, aged 2 more years. And the Californians once again outperformed the French. A larger repeat in 2006 with the original wines, now aged for 30 years, produced Californian victories in both the red and white categories. The methodology was always the same. Blind tasting, identical conditions, and no labels. The results kept pointing in the same direction. The French establishment kept finding reasons to claim the methodology was flawed. Meanwhile, Californian wine built the infrastructure that turned the original anomaly into a permanent reorganization. The decade following the 1976 judgment saw considerable investment in Napa Valley vineyards. A generation of winemakers trained in both California and France, and the development of a critical infrastructure of journalists and specialized publications that provided American consumers with a vocabulary to evaluate domestic wine on its own terms, rather than always comparing it to French models. By the 1990s, Napa Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay were fetching prices comparable to their Bordeaux and Burgundy equivalents. The Judgment of Paris had not created that reality. It had given a name to something that was already starting to be true, and it had provided it with a story, and as Rudy Kurniawan would later prove, a story can be the most powerful thing to happen to a wine. The fraud, $1.3 billion in fake Burgundy. In 2012, federal investigators searching the home of Rudy Kurniawan in Arcadia, California, discovered a counterfeiting operation of extraordinary scale and sophistication. Kurniawan, an Indonesian-born wine collector who had become one of the most celebrated figures in the American premium wine market, was under investigation following a complaint by Laurent Ponceau, owner of Domaine Ponceau in Burgundy. Ponceau had been shown an auction catalogue of wines that included bottles of Domaine Ponceau Clos Saint-Denis from vintages going all the way back to 1945. The problem Ponceau immediately detected was that Domaine Ponceau had not produced Clos Saint-Denis until 1982. In Courniawan's home, investigators found thousands of old corks from authentically rare bottles, hundreds of original labels from various vintages and producers, corking machines, capsule applicators, and laboratory equipment for preparing wine blends. His notebooks contained formulas for replicating specific wines from specific producers and vintages, instructions for combining percentages of different wines and approximating the flavor profile of a bottle valued at thousands of dollars. He manufactured fake Petrus, fake Romani Conti, and fake DRC in his kitchen, and sold them at auctions at prices determined by the supposed rarity of the bottles, not by their actual content. The losses suffered by the collectors who bought his wines were estimated at $1.3 billion. Courniawan was convicted of mail and wire fraud in 2013 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. After his conviction, massive anxiety arose in the collecting world over bottles acquired during the previous decade. Many had already been consumed. Others remained in private cellars, authenticated solely by the fact that a respected collector had vouched for them, and that collector was now in prison. The Courniawan case revealed something the wine market did not want to examine. Its authentication systems were social, not scientific. A bottle was considered authentic because a credible person vouched for it, because it came from a reputable source, or because the label and cork looked right to the eyes of people who had seen thousands of labels and corks. Chemical analyses were rarely used because they were expensive, and their results were often ambiguous. A collector who submits a bottle for chemical authentication is implicitly acknowledging that they doubt it, which reduces its value even before the analysis is performed. The wine market had operated for a century on the basis of trust. Courniawan understood this perfectly. He was not selling wine. He was selling provenance. And provenance was a story he had learned to tell very well. What is wine? And what has it always been? The wines at the center of the Courniawan case were expensive because of everything that surrounded them, not because of what they contained. The label, the producer, the history, the tale of their previous owners. That was the product. The liquid was the medium through which the story was transmitted. This is not a cynical observation about wine. It is one of the most chemically complex beverages consumed by humans and contains hundreds of aromatic compounds that interact in ways that science still cannot fully predict or replicate. The flavor depends on the geology of the soil, the climate of each year, the way the vine was pruned, the timing of the harvest, the fermentation temperature, the age and origin of the oak barrel, and the storage conditions over years or decades. No two bottles from the same vineyard and the same vintage are exactly identical. But wine is also fascinating for something that goes far beyond chemistry. It is one of the few beverages that has consistently served as a carrier of meaning greater than its own consumption for 1.3 billion Catholics. Wine has been the blood of Christ in the Eucharist for 2,000 years. For the Greeks, it was the technology of civilization that distinguished free men from barbarians. For Rome, it was the infrastructure of the empire, transported in standardized vessels across 40 provinces. For the monasteries of the post-Roman centuries, it was the reason to keep knowledge alive, maintain records, and continue observing which plot produced better fruit than the one next to it. For Napoleon III, it was a national brand that demanded a classification. For Courniawan, it was the most lucrative storytelling market he could find. None of these relationships with wine are solely about the liquid. the Greek word for the toasts exchanged at a symposium, propoma, literally meant what is drunk before, indicating that the wine preceded the content of the gathering that made it possible. Wine was not the goal. Wine made the goal possible. All traditions organized around wine have understood this implicitly. That is why Kurniawan's fraud worked so well. He sold the story that the wine carries, and that story was worth more than the wine itself. The global wine market is worth approximately $400 billion a year today. 3/4 of it is consumed in Europe and North America. Among populations that no longer retain any memory of making their own wine and that have no specific need for the product beyond preference. In those markets, wine competes with beer, spirits, water, and a dozen beverage categories. It wins thanks to the accumulated weight of everything it carries. The Georgian qvevri, the Roman amphorae, the Cistercian monks walking their fields, the 1855 broker who jotted down a price, the French judges trying to take back their ballots in 1976, the man in Arcadia who understood that a story about wine is worth more than the wine itself. A bottle invisibly contains all of that, along with whatever is inside the glass. Back to the buried vessel. The 2017 discovery at Gadakrili Gora changed the timeline of wine in a way that its discoverers considered philosophically significant. The sites are located in the Georgian region of Qvevri, an area where wine has been made in buried clay jars for more than 8,000 years without interruption. The Soviet period attempted to industrialize Georgian wine. Collective farms replaced estate vineyards. Some qvevri were destroyed and never replaced. But in many villages, the tradition continued because it was the way wine was made, and no other method had managed to entirely displace it. The very qualities that made qvevri wine seem old-fashioned for much of the 20th century turned out to be exactly what a new generation of consumers was looking for. The amber color produced by skin contact, the tannins, the cloudiness, and the absence of the clean, fruity flavors that modern winemaking tries to optimize in the 21st century were no longer flaws. They were the goal. The natural wine movement, which had been forming in France since the 1980s and accelerated sharply after 2010, rejected the techniques that had dominated production since the 70s. Industrial yeast strains, added sulfites, fining, filtration, and micro-oxygenation. Instead, it wanted wines that expressed the character of a specific place in a specific year, made with minimal technological intervention. This description of qvevri wine could have been written in the year 4000 BC. The innovation of the natural wine movement lies in having rediscovered a set of practices that predate almost all other winemaking traditions and declaring them the future today. Sommeliers in London and Tokyo bring bottles from Georgian producers to tables where customers pay as much for a qvevri orange wine as they would for a decent Burgundy. The oldest wine in the world is also the most exciting wine in the world. That probably says something about wine. It certainly says something about us. Stephen Spurrier died in 2021, at the age of 79. He spent the last years of his life making wine in the Languedoc on a small estate he and his wife had bought in the 1990s. In interviews, he explained that the judgment of Paris was never intended to attack French wine. He fully expected the French wines to win, and that is why he had framed the event as a bicentennial celebration and not a competition. From his point of view, the victory of the Californian wines was a genuine surprise. What he had not foreseen was the French reaction, not the commercial adaptation that eventually arrived, but the initial refusal to accept the data. He had discovered that prestige, once accumulated over centuries, does not easily accept the invitation to be revised. In the mountains south of Tbilisi, the new wine season is marked by the Ratoveli Festival, the harvest celebration that has ended the summer in this region for as long as memory reaches. The grapes come in from the hillside vineyards. The must flows into the buried qvevri, which are sealed for the winter. The yeasts work in the darkness. In the spring, the jars are opened. What comes out of them has been shaped by the specific soil of that hillside, the particular climate of that year, the specific decisions of the person tending the vineyard, and 8,000 years of accumulated experience. It is amber, tannic, complex, and unlike any wine produced in Burgundy or the Napa Valley, the Greek judges of a symposium would have diluted it in a 3-to-1 ratio and considered it barbaric. The monks of Citeaux would not have known what to do with it. Napoleon III's brokers would not have found a price category in which to place it. Rudy Kurniawan would not have known how to counterfeit it. But people order it today in the wine bars of London and New York. And the people who buried the first qvevri in Gadacrili 8,000 years ago would have recognized it immediately. Some things survive, not because someone protected them, but because they were made right from the very beginning.